For those of you just joining us, this is Carissa Kranz. You're live on Sirius Radio and on the Law and Crime Network. We're watching the Shaun Harrison trial out of Boston, and right now on the stand is a witness. His name is Kevin Perez. He is a student at the pastor's school. He is on cross-examination, and this is important because a couple of key things have been said in the minutes leading up to this recap here. First, we know that he met with the pastor Harrison about twice a week, that he was asked to sell weed to help the pastor with his side drug dealing business, that he was asked to fight the victim, Luis Rodriguez, and that his testimony is pretty much corroborating the victim's testimony, that this pastor, who has this facade of mentoring kids and being an upstanding citizen of society, is actually doing quite the opposite behind the scenes in running a drug business. With me is Francey Hakes, a former prosecutor, as a guest. Francey, are you with me?
I'm here, Carissa.
Okay, I hear her. I hope the viewers can hear her as well. I don't see us up on the screen, so I'll continue to ask you a question unless I hear we should go back into the courtroom. But it looks like they're just on cross-examination, and it looks a little quiet. Okay, it looks a little quiet right now. So Francey, this is a kind of a Jekyll and Hyde type of defendant. On one hand, he's this reverend, he's this upstanding person in society, he's mentoring students, he works at a high school, he's advocating against guns and violence and drugs. And then we have this other side of him that seems to be a dark side, where he's running a drug business and he's asking his students that he mentors to basically enter the drug gang community, which is a dangerous community, by having them sell drugs on his behalf to make money, and to fight on his behalf, and to even shoot on his behalf, which is what we're hearing right now in cross-examination from Kevin Perez, one of the students at the school. So you're a former federal prosecutor. You have a good sense of defense strategy. What do you think the jury wants to hear? Do you think the jury needs to hear from the defendant himself to explain this bipolar type of personality behavior?
Well, juries always want to hear from defendants. They sometimes do, and they sometimes don't. And of course, the Constitution protects the defendant. The jury's not allowed to take any inferences from, if the defendant doesn't testify, from the fact that he didn't testify. I think, though, Carissa, what's so interesting about this Perez testimony and cross-examination is that he's violating some of the rules that I set down for witnesses when I was a prosecutor. He comes off as very genuine, but he definitely seems uncomfortable. He is a little defiant and argumentative, a little smart alecky with the defense attorney sometimes, which is a very natural reaction. But as a prosecutor, I always wanted my witnesses to try to look as credible as possible. And sometimes when you're argumentative, you come off as less than credible.
Yes, I can see what you're saying. And for those of you that are just joining us, there's been a couple times where in cross-examination, we've heard the questions asked 10 different ways, trying to get a specific answer, it seems, out. And there was even one point where they approached the witness to refresh his recollection with grand jury testimony to try to get a better answer, or a clearer answer, or to discredit the witness. We're going to jump back into the courtroom. We're going to continue cross-examination here of Kevin Perez. He's a student at the pastor's school, and he has some really key pieces of information to add for jury deliberations. Welcome back. They're having a sidebar right now in the courtroom. This is the Shaun Harrison trial out of Boston. This is the case where a pastor, a mentor, is accused of shooting a student execution style in the back of his head for a drug deal gone bad. And it gets worse. We're listening to witnesses on the stand right now who also went to the school, other students he mentored, who are saying that they were also asked to sell drugs for the pastor, and that they were even asked to attack and shoot the victim, Luis Rodriguez. We need to jump to a quick break, but when we get back, we're going to jump right back into the courtroom for live testimony, and we're going to have some in-studio analysis with our guest, former prosecutor, federal prosecutor, Francey Hakes. Stick with us. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network, and we are live on Sirius Radio, so a special welcome to those listeners on Channel 109. For those of you just joining us, we are following the Shaun Harrison trial out of Boston, a 2015 case where a reverend, a pastor of an English high school, is accused of shooting a student that he mentored execution style for a drug deal gone bad. We're listening to some live testimony from witnesses in the courtroom, and right now on the stand we are in cross-examination of Kevin Perez. Kevin is able to testify that he has direct knowledge of the reverend, showing him drugs in his desk at school, weapons in his desk at school, asking him to sell drugs for him, and asking him to attack and even shoot the victim, Luis Rodriguez, for him to do his dirty work. We've heard from a host of witnesses, and with me for some in-studio analysis is former federal prosecutor Francey Hakes. Francey, are you there with me?
I'm here, Carissa.
Okay, great. So there you are. It's nice to see you. Thanks for joining us. So what do you make of all these witnesses that we're hearing from? It seems like they have valuable testimony to lend, but they also have their own demons in their own way.
They do. It's one of the hardest things for a prosecutor to deal with when most, if not all, of your witnesses are people who've been involved in the criminal activity with the charged defendant. None of them come with clean hands. You know, you don't have the Pope or some cardinal witnessing crime typically. It's people who are there on the ground committing the crime with the charged person.
So real quick, you're hearing these people coming and giving testimony and admitting to crimes themselves, which you just said is muddying the waters for you know, taking away from their own credibility. Could charges be brought against them as well?
Well, they certainly could have been brought, but presumably they're testifying under some kind of grant of immunity where the prosecution has said, you know, it's okay for you to admit that you were dealing drugs with the defendant. You're not going to be prosecuted for that.
Right. Okay. So right now on the stand, as you can see here, for those of you listening in, you don't see the screen, but we're in cross-examination of Kevin Perez. He's a student at the high school, and he's giving some really key testimony here, which corroborates the victim's story. Remember, the victim is alive, the victim survived, and this is all caught on surveillance video. The problem with the surveillance video of who the shooter is the video is not of the best quality, but it seems to be there's enough circumstantial and direct evidence to still point fingers to the pastor, to the reverend of the high school for leading this double life. Let's jump back into the courtroom and listen to the cross-examination of Kevin Perez. It's interesting to listen to because he's a little hostile. Questions are being asked about 10 different ways, and he's getting agitated and aggravated, which is not only, you know, is he admitting to some crimes on his own, but he's taking away his own credibility by getting so defensive. Let's take a look. Welcome back. I'm Carissa Kranz, your host on the Law and Crime Network and also on Sirius Radio at this moment. We are covering the Shaun Harrison trial. This is a Boston case, a case of a reverend, a pastor, who shot a student in the back of his head, execution style, for a drug deal gone bad. He has a Jekyll and Hyde personality. On one hand, he is an upstanding member of society, mentoring students, trying to keep them out of the drug and gang community. And on another hand, he is luring these students into his office, showing them drugs, showing them weapons, asking them to do his dirty work and hurt other drug dealers that he's training because drug deals and weed sales are down. With me, I have former federal prosecutor Francey Hakes. Francey, thanks for joining us and sticking with us. You've been listening to some of this testimony from Kevin Perez. He's gleaned some interesting light. I mean, on one hand, he has direct evidence that he has met with the pastor. He's seen the drugs in his desk. He's seen the weapons. He heard the pastor ask him and another student to attack and even kill the victim, Luis Rodriguez. What is the bombshell piece of evidence you think the jury needs to hear to convict this guy? Because right now I could say I don't think it's going well for him.
Yeah, it's not going well for him. I think the jury wants to hear someone accuse him of committing the crime, which I think the victim already did. But because the victim admitted to being a drug dealer, he admitted to criminal behavior and probably admitted to initially not telling the truth to police about his own activities, just the way Kevin Perez just did. The prosecution felt like they had to bolster the victim. And in order to do that, they have to bring other people inside that same drug dealing circle to tell a similar story. And that's exactly what they've done.
Right. So the shooting was captured on surveillance video, and the victim survived. So that's what's so interesting in this case. We have a surviving victim who is saying the Reverend did it. And the Reverend is saying, nope, not me, not guilty, I didn't do it, I'm just the Rev. And so we need all these other witnesses to come in and add, credibility to the victim's testimony that this Reverend, this pastor, this dean, this headmaster that has so much credibility in the community doesn't deserve all this credibility after all. He did plead not guilty, but the charges brought against him are armed assault, intent to murder, illegal possession of drugs, firearms, and ammunition. We've heard from witnesses earlier today where they were a neighbor who was able to corroborate that ammunition and drugs and guns were kept in a storage unit by his house. And now we're listening to a student on the stand who was able to corroborate testimony of a fight that broke out earlier that day where the victim, Luis Rodriguez, was attacked at the direction of the Reverend because weed sales were down. When the attack didn't go well, he asked these students to help take him out. The students did not want to go along with that plan, so that night the Reverend decided to take matters into his own hands, allegedly, and shot the student in the back of his head, execution style, and ran. But the victim survived, and there's surveillance video, and the prosecution is making their case. The courtroom is on a quick break right now, and with me I have with me I have the guest, former prosecutor Francey Hakes, but I was just told that we need to throw to a break, so stick with us and we'll be right back. Padano, she is the defendant's neighbor. We are watching the Shaun Harrison trial out of Boston, where with me is former prosecutor Francey Hakes. Francey, just a quick recap for those of you just joining us, and then I want to ask you a couple questions about this witness that we're hearing from. Seems like she's got some interesting insight and circumstantial evidence to help build a case against the defendant and what his life truly is like. This is a 2015 case where a pastor is accused. He's standing trial right now for the shooting of a 17-year-old boy he mentored at school in the back of the head, execution style. The motive is supposedly a drug deal gone bad and decreased weed sales. The Reverend and pastor says that he is an upstanding citizen and he is mentoring kids in the community, and he stands for anti-guns and anti-violence. But on the side, based on the evidence that's coming in, it seems like the case is being built against him, that he's more of a Jekyll and Hyde type carrier, and that he's actually mentoring students to enter the gang world and to sell drugs. Right now, we just was listening to testimony from Chelsea Padano. She is the neighbor. As you just heard her speaking, she was saying that she went into the apartment, she could smell weed, she was giving some insight into the storage unit, which we now know that's where he kept some weed and guns and ammunition. What does this testimony mean for the prosecution and the defense?
Well, this witness is a boon for the prosecution because she appears to be anyway neutral. She's someone who wasn't in his circle. She didn't go to that school. She had no involvement there at all or in his drug dealing circle. So she should be perceived by the jury as someone who has no axe to grind with the defendant. I'm sure the defense is going to try to find something, but as it appears right now, she's just a neutral witness, and that makes her gold. She's testifying about sort of the lifestyle of the Reverend, which was obviously in complete opposition to the face that he was presenting to the public. And it's very important in this case for the prosecution to show that real Jekyll and Hyde-ness of the Reverend. They specifically want to show that he was more Hyde than he was ever Dr. Jekyll.
Yes, and that's why I think they asked the question, what kind of foot traffic did you see? And then that's when she said, more at night, more towards the weekend. And had you ever been in the apartment? The answer was yes, I've been in the apartment. What did you see in the apartment? Well, it was very similar to my apartment, but it had more clutter and it smelled like weed. So we're getting some real interesting nuggets of information that the jurors are probably downloading, which they'll take back with them to the deliberation room when they come up with their ultimate verdict. The courtroom is currently on a break. and we need to take a quick break. So stick with us, and we're going to come back and continue to follow these trials. We're following this one and a couple other riveting cases on the Law and Crime Network and on Sirius Radio. So stay tuned. Welcome back. That is Chelsea Padano, the neighbor of the defendant, Shaun Harrison, who is standing trial right now for a 2015 case of intent to murder a student that he was mentoring in high school. Apparently, or allegedly, he was running a drug ring on the side, even though he was a pastor, and held himself out as an activist in the community against gun violence and gang violence. And we are listening to the prosecution's case, building the case against the pastor, and that was Chelsea Padano. And with me is former federal prosecutor Francey Hakes. Francey, thanks for joining us. I know our time is running short with you. What do you make of all this? Guilty or not guilty?
Oh, you're really putting me on the spot on this one. Gosh, it sure looks to me like he's guilty of being Jekyll and Hyde. He's guilty of running a drug ring. He's guilty of asking students to assault and murder others. And certainly, according to the victim, he's guilty of assault with intent to murder. So at this point, I think it does not look good for the Rev, as he likes to call himself.
Okay, and what do you make with your prior experience here? I mean, this is a pastor, this is a reverend. He does have, instances in the community where he has stood up and talked and tried to have at least the image or the facade of being an upstanding citizen, a mentor for students. And while we're learning about this dark side right now, this Jekyll and Hyde type of figure, how will these mitigating factors play in for a jury and possibly sentencing later?
Well, that's a great question. This is going to be a classic case, I think, of the defense bringing in a parade of character witnesses. In most criminal cases, especially in drug and violent crime cases, the defendant doesn't really have pillars of the community to bring in to testify about how wonderful they are. But I suspect that this defendant is going to have that. So the jury is going to have to deal with testimony from person after person coming in and raving about what a man of good character he is. And maybe even the judge will allow examples of good character in this particular case. It'll be an interesting legal fight if they try to bring that in, but I definitely expect him to bring in what's generally called good character witnesses.
Right, character witnesses. Well, nobody's all good and all bad. Well, most of the time. We've certainly witnessed trials here on the Law and Crime Network where it does seem like it's just pure evil. But this is a more complicated case. This is a human case with lots of layers to peel away and lots of testimony to consider, and a human element that the jurors are going to have to consider in their deliberations. And they're going to definitely be instructed that, despite any personal beliefs or inclinations or, having a pastor standing trial, that they have to set all that aside and follow the law. Right now, we're going to jump into testimony in the courtroom of another witness. This witness's name is Kevin Perez. He is a student at the high school, and he has firsthand knowledge of Harrison's side business of drug dealing. He's able to testify that there's weed in his office at school, that there's weapons in his office at school, that he is soliciting other students at school to sell drugs for him on his behalf, and to attack the victim, Luis Rodriguez, for weed sales going down. This is interesting testimony to watch because he's shedding light onto a dark light, actually. He's not shedding light, he's shedding a shadow. He's casting darkness onto the Reverend. But then we hear him also in cross-examination getting feisty and a little bit biting and defensive. He's a good witness to listen to. He shows a lot of color, and let's listen in and see what he has to say now. And there you have it, incriminating testimony by a witness for the prosecution in the Shaun Harrison trial out of Boston. That is a student. His name is Kevin Perez, and he testified saying the motive of why the Reverend, the pastor, would want the victim, Luis Rodriguez, dead. And the reason? Money. He owed him money for weed, for drug deals, because sales were down. We're also hearing testimony about how in his office he had about 15 grams of weed. That was estimated by the witness. This is direct examination of the witness on the stand, Kevin Perez, and weapons in the office, a knife. With me to analyze this, former prosecutor Francey Hakes. Francey, I mean, this is pretty incriminating testimony we're hearing.
It is, and it's really interesting, too, to see the demeanor differences in this witness when he's on direct examination and on cross-examination. He's clearly a little nervous, a little bit uncomfortable, but generally speaking, has a good rapport with the prosecutor. His evidence is powerful. He has established motive here.
That's huge, right? Motive. I mean, that just came out. It was a flat... Here's the motive. I mean, he was asked the question, did he tell you why? And the answer to why was because he owed him money for weed. We got clear motive. I mean, I don't know how the defense could rehabilitate that on cross-examination. This is such a strong direct.
Well, it is a strong direct, and their only choice is to make the witness look like a liar, to try to dirty him up and make him look bad, to destroy his credibility. I don't think they are going to be able to do it. I mean, his opportunity to see what he says he saw, how the case is bolstered by the neighbor and, of course, the victim himself. This is a very, very strong case for the prosecution, and I don't think the Rev is getting out of it.
Right. So let's hold that thought and see the ability of the defense to come back on this with cross-examination, because it is a strong case for direct examination. But before we go back and check out that cross-examination, we have to take a quick break. But stick with us, because the cross-examination will be interesting to dissect. That is cross-examination of Kevin Perez, a student at the high school who is speaking for the prosecution's case. The prosecution, although that is cross-examination you're listening to, the prosecution is still putting on his case against the pastor, the headmaster, who is standing trial right now for intent to murder a student that he mentored for a drug deal gone bad, specifically decreased weed sales. The pastor is allegedly caught on surveillance video for shooting the student in the back of his head, execution style. The student lived to tell the story, and that's why the pastor is now standing trial, and we're listening to all this circumstantial evidence that the state's bringing in to lend some insight onto the Jekyll and Hyde character of this upstanding citizen, yet at night is living a double life of drug dealings and sales and soliciting his students that he's mentoring to actually help him deal in drugs. With me, I have former prosecutor Francey Hakes. Francey, final thoughts before we go for the end of the day.
Well, Carissa, it's been a very interesting day of testimony in this trial, and Kevin Perez was a great witness. He also caused the prosecution a little bit of difficulty, I think, with his attitude on cross-examination. He's obviously quite intelligent, and he knows that his credibility is being questioned, and he doesn't like it. And I always told my witnesses, no matter how much they were annoyed by the defense attorney, don't show it and don't argue with them. But he's starting to do that, and that will signal to the defense attorney that he can be rattled. Right. And that is what the defense attorney is trying hard to do, is rattle. Okay.
We've got a wrap for the end of the day. Tomorrow, this will pick up live in the courtroom. So please join us here live on the Long Crime Network and Sirius Radio with your host, Jesse Weber. I'm signing off now. That's a wrap.